In the late Bronze Age, the Mycenaean Greeks participated in long-distance interactions around the Mediterranean Sea from a handful of palace centers such as Mycenae, Thebes, Tiryns, and Pylos. Sorry, I'm having some trouble with that. We assume that the Mycenaean Greeks were great seafarers, and the empirical evidence for this is the thousands of Mycenaean artifacts found at coastal sites throughout the eastern and central Mediterranean, from Egypt to the Levant and Italy and Sicily. This reputation is enhanced by the stories of Odysseus's adventures, which, although set to writing much later, are thought to find their origin in the late Bronze Age world. There are even a few depictions of ships dating to the time of the Mycenaean palaces. However, the obstacles to understanding the reality of Mycenaean maritime life and maritime networks are formidable. One set of problems relates to Mycenaean participation in long-distance trade with the East. There are no ship remains from a Mycenaean vessel. The famous late Bronze Age wrecks at Galadonia and Alubarun are almost certainly Levantine in origin. We also don't know if the distribution of Mycenaean artifacts means that they actually traveled to all of those places, for example, voyaging all the way to Egypt rather than doing business through Cypriot or Levantine middlemen. The only written records contemporary with the palaces, the Linear B tablets, mention nothing directly about long-distance maritime interaction, which can only be inferred from circumstantial evidence, such as mentions of Cypriot projects and people or slave women from Asia Minor at Pylos. Now, these are ongoing problems, but I would like to call attention today to the local scale of Mycenaean maritime activity, which has attracted less interest and about which we know very little. I focus on two glaring gaps in our knowledge about Mycenaean seafaring. The first is we have little secure knowledge about where the Mycenaean harbors and other landing sites were. This results in part from an obsession with maritime trade of the great emporia of the Near East and Egypt, thus a lack of attention to the local scale. But just as important is that harbors of the Mycenaean period have been rendered virtually invisible on the Greek coastal landscape of today, erased by millennia of geomorphological change and doomed to obscurity by the practices of the Mycenaeans themselves. First, there's little evidence that the Mycenaeans built durable harbor infrastructure like quays, jetties, or breakwaters. These durable harbor structures seem to be a post-Bronze Age phenomenon in the Aegean. Sorry. There we go. Instead, like the Homeric heroes of the Odyssey, they relied on natural embayments where boats could be pulled up on sandy shores or anchored or moored offshore in locations protected naturally from wind and waves. Many anchorages would have served mainly as safe havens or occasionally for economic transactions. These might not even have an associated settlement. This contributes to low archaeological visibility. This problem is exacerbated by long-term coastal change. Coastal zones are among the most dynamic settings on Earth. They are constantly reworked by long-term natural processes of erosion, deposition, and tectonics, which can be augmented by human activities. Over time, coastal features change, appear, and disappear. Sometimes the effects are dramatic. For example, the massive silting in the natural bays of the eastern coast of the Aegean Sea. Here we see the ancient Latmian Gulf, into which the river Meander emptied, was once a vast marine embayment extending at least 40 kilometers east to west. Miletos, the Minoan and then Mycenaean colony, here. So, yeah, I'm trying that. Okay, sorry, I can't get it to work. Yeah. Pressing that. Oh, well, okay. Well, you see Miletos there. The Miletos, the Minoan, and then Mycenaean colony mentioned in Hittite records was situated strategically on its southern shore. However, sedimentation from both natural and anthropogenic causes advanced the shoreline inexorably westward until in late antiquity, Miletos was no longer a coastal site and today sits some 7 to 8 kilometers inland. The processes of plate tectonics are even more insidious because their effects can be so variable and localized. The Aegean sits directly over a subduction zone where the African tectonic plate is moving northward and grinding underneath the Eurasian plate. This results in volcanoes, earthquakes, mountain building, and a complex set of faults underlying the Greek landmass and seabed, creating variable tectonic effects on regional and local scales. And we can look at a few examples. The Carinthia is a good example of regional tectonics. The Corinthian Gulf Coast is lifting up. You can see that on the left and the top, while the Saronic coast is subsiding. In classical antiquity, the port of Lechion on the top was uplifted, while the Saronic port Kenkriai subsided in a series of earthquakes and is now submerged. The tectonic effects are also quite localized because coastal configuration is often controlled by localized fault systems. The second gap is we know next to nothing about the maritime communities that inhabited the harbors and other coastal settlements of Mycenaean Greece. Palaces were not coastal sites by and large, so they were not anchorages or harbors per se. The linear B tablets give us little direct information about coastal communities, and archaeologists are only just beginning to search for and investigate these unobtrusive sites. But why shift our focus to small coastal sites and local networks? The missing local scale exposes a serious imbalance because in the late Bronze Age, most coastal dwellers rarely, if ever, ventured more than a few tens of kilometers from their communities. Long-distance travel was rare by contrast. Yet these communities, these small worlds, were buzzing with activity and connectivity. The real lifeline for these communities lay in local-scale networks for subsistence and trade, intermarriage, and other social ties. Because of these strong ties, local networks tend to be more stable and enduring than very large maritime structures, such as empires and thalassocracies, which are more fragile and susceptible to rupture with changing political fortunes. They're often artificially configured to serve the unique needs of large-scale political entities. By contrast, local networks are easier to maintain from a practical point of view, since distances and environmental obstacles are less inhibitive, and they're often founded on long-established and deeply embedded social ties. So it's no surprise that they persist even during periods of external domination and revert to familiar patterns once released from external control. So it's at the local scale that we should look for the true fabric of Mycenaean life. So I propose that we can best recover these communities and their networks by creating a systematic, conceptual, and methodological framework that is archaeologically testable. And here's the framework that I propose. To address this, a research framework that includes, there we go, I had skipped a slide there. A conceptual framework for their locations and organization. Second, field work, focusing on geoarchaeology and archaeology. Third, mining linear B and early Greek literature, especially Homer's Odyssey and Hesiod's works and days. And lastly, ethnoarchaeology in a cross-cultural comparative framework. Okay. Begin with the conceptual framework. I visualize Mycenaean maritime networks as a nested set of geographical scales from local to international with some key disclaimers. it might look like here. First of all, the boundaries are fuzzy, not actually real. Second, they are never static. They change over time and are thus dynamic. Thirdly, the larger scales intrude on the smaller in the movement of people of goods, and because local history responds to and is often transformed by events unfolding at larger scales. So let's begin with the local scale first, starting with the scale I call the Coastscape. This is the coastal zone defined by habitation, interaction, practice, and perception. The Coastscape is both liminal and central. Where land meets sea, coastal dwellers occupy a transition between contrasting ecological zones and their productive resources. But they were also central and connective, the meeting places for land and sea dwellers. Elements of the Coastscape include the shoreline and adjacent coastal lowland that may be inhabited and exploited by a maritime community, the connective routes and openings into the interior following natural paths connecting coast and hinterland. These are often delimited by ridges or mountains that block views to the interior and impede easy passage. Third, the inshore waters that are utilized on a daily basis for economic and social purposes. And fourth, the visual seascape, the everyday field of view that defines the cognitive horizon in the seaward direction. And these are defined topographically and also archaeologically, for example, through intensive surface survey, as I've suggested in the example here, the mouth of the Acheron River in Epirus. The second is maritime small worlds. These are micro-regional interaction spheres that form as aggregates of many neighboring coastscapes. They're constituted by habitual face-to-face interaction and cohesion based on shared origin, cultural traditions, language, economic ties, social networks, mutual protection, and so forth. The relationships among these communities may be hierarchical, orbiting around a powerful polity, but will often be non-hierarchical or heterarchical. Proximity, intervisibility, and ease of travel enhance the cohesion of small worlds. A small world is a scale that dominates maritime interaction overall. And just to give you a couple of examples, here is Cyprian Broodbank's depiction of small worlds through time in the early Bronze Age Cycladic islands. And an example that I'm going to talk about momentarily, the Saronic maritime small world is a kind of ideal small world situation. The regional or intracultural maritime sphere I envision as occurring in a geographical space beyond the small world, outside the realm of habitual face-to-face interaction, but still characterized by recognizably Mycenaean material culture, custom, and beliefs, but occurring less frequently than interactions in the small world, but considerably more often than those involving long-distance cross-cultural relations. So, but at this scale, a very important transition occurred, and Diamantis kind of touched on this. Moving beyond the safe and familiar, maritime travel was in the hands of specialist sailors and merchants plying the seas in seagoing vessels. They possessed knowledge of sea routes, navigation in a range of conditions, open sea and coastwise sailing, winds, currents, storms, landing sites en route and at the final destination, and personal relationships with people along the way. This transition finds support in ethnographic examples of recent seafaring, for example in the South Pacific, where most young men learn to navigate in local waters for fishing or visiting, but only a few achieve the navigational skill required for long-distance open sea voyaging. We also see this difference in the locally seagoing farmers of Hesiod's works and days versus the far-voyaging sea captains of Homeric epic. Roughly in the 13th century BC, the Mycenaean maritime culture region would have looked something like this. Again, very fuzzy boundaries. And finally, the interregional, intercultural maritime interaction sphere involves interactions and networks that extend beyond the Mycenaean maritime cultural area. Sporadic visits of Mycenaeans to lands beyond the Aegean, at least to Cyprus and the northern Levantine coast in the east, as well as southern Italy and Sicily in the west. So activity in this sphere is best represented by the Alubarone and Geladonia shipwrecks, and I think here you can just insert Diamante's research. Okay, now moving to field work, and actually actualizing these concepts. A first step has to be geomorphology. We must study each local case separately because even locations a few kilometers apart may have very different tectonics controlled by different faults and thus different histories. Let me give a couple of examples from the Saronic Gulf. And here you see a coring operation, taking cores in order to characterize the different paleo environments, coastal environments. Example from my own research here. In the case of the recently discovered Mycenaean harbor settlement at Kalamianos, which you see in the lower right, that location, we can see that the location is not at the modern sheltered bay at Korphos on the left, but at a seemingly unlikely spot. And this is what the coast at Kalamianos looks like today, entirely unsuitable for a harbor, having subsided over time. But our geomorphologists have been able to reconstruct the changing configuration of the Bronze Age harbor to show two reasonably sheltered anchorages. So over on the left, the bottom is the early Helladic II, and the middle is late Helladic III, sort of restoring these sheltered anchorages. We also learned that Korphos Bay, this lovely sheltered bay, probably didn't exist in the Bronze Age. So a cautionary tale. Another example is the Piraeus. The Piraeus was the port of classical Athens, and this was also true in the Bronze Age, but it looked very different. This slide shows that the Piraeus was an island in the Neolithic, top right, but by the late Bronze Age had evolved into a superb lagoonal harbor sheltered from waves by beach ridges and with openings for ships to enter and exit, and that's labeled on the bottom left there. Now, once you understand the geomorphological principles and have your eye trained to the landscape, you can search for prehistoric harbors in many ways. For example, by testing historical and modern harbors for Bronze Age predecessors, and by recognizing indicative landforms such as deltas, coastal wetlands, sandy coastal plains, and so forth. All of this hand in hand with archaeological reconnaissance. Now let us see how we can investigate coastscapes and small worlds archaeologically with an example in the Saronic Gulf from two perspectives. From the dominant center at Colonna on the island of Aeginetan, which is circled, and then from a small coastal settlement at Korphos Kalamianos, which is labeled with the red label. So with many coastal and island settlements, the Saronic is an ideal maritime small world because it's well bounded by the enclosing land masses of the Argolid, Corinthia, and Attica. Sea voyaging in the relatively calm waters is considered easy, and a high level of intervisibility promotes intensive interactions in local scale social and economic networks. Colonna on the island of Aeginetan dominated the small world for a millennium from about 2500 to 1400 BC, but during that time, the small world oscillated between cohesion and fragmentation, primarily because small worlds are enmeshed in and respond to larger networks and historical processes unfolding at larger geographic scales. Beginning in the early Bronze Age, relations of small coastal settlements with Aegina waxed and waned as the attention of Colonna's inhabitants shifted into and away from the Gulf. Colonna is a highly complex fortified site with 9 separate urban phases in the Bronze Age. From a millennium from about 2500 to 1500, as I said, Colonna was a site without peer in the Aegean, except, of course, for the Minoan civilization on Crete. So if we begin in early Helladic II, this was a time of precocious complexity in the Aegean, and Colonna was one of a number of large coastal settlements. During EH2 and EH3, Colonna grew from a modest settlement of mud brick houses to one of the most prominent urban centers in the Aegean, densely populated, heavily fortified, with monumental stone buildings and sophisticated town planning. The so-called Vices House, shown here, was a monumental building of the corridor house type, like those found at contemporary mainland sites, and possibly played a central administrative role in the community. Early Helladic III witnessed dramatic changes. Settlements dispersed or disappeared all over the southern Greek mainland and islands. In some areas, settlement did not recover until the late Middle Helladic period, up to 500 years. By contrast, Colonna emerged as the singular dominant power in the Saronic in the late 3rd millennium. Beginning in EH3, the Aiginetans imported pottery from the Peloponnese, central Greece, and the Cycladic islands. And by the beginning of the Middle Bronze Age, these same areas had begun to import Aiginetan tableware, storage vessels, and cooking pots. This is the main distribution of Aiginetan pottery exports in the Middle Bronze Age in the Aegean. Now, ties with Minoan Crete, and you see Crete at the bottom, were also strong. Alongside Minoan imports on Aegina, a local industry of imitation Minoan ceramics emerged, perhaps operated by resident Cretan craftsmen. This evidence suggests that the Aiginetans shifted their focus to more distant trading partners, partially in response to the demographic crash on the Greek mainland. The Shaftgrave period, which witnessed the rise of Mycenae and the recolonization of the interior, revived intensive interaction with the Saronic and the northeastern Peloponnese, starting in MH3 and peaking in late Helladic I to II. This was a time of the greatest cohesion of the Colonna-centered Saronic world, as indicated by the abundance of imported Aiginetan pottery at most sites in its orbit. There are also signs of emerging competition between Colonna and Mycenae. The rarity of early Mycenaean painted pottery at Colonna and in the Saronic region, despite easy trade routes, may indicate a deliberate exclusionary strategy on the part of the Aiginetans. In the 15th century, Mycenaean-style pottery began to spread for the first time in the Saronic region. Still, Colonna's pottery export industry declined only after 1400 BC, coinciding with the construction of the first palace at Mycenae itself. By this time, it appears that Mycenae had begun to expand politically as well as economically, poised to replace Colonna as the dominant power in the Saronic Gulf. The construction of the palace at Mycenae ushered in the Palatial period, and the number of sites in the Saronic almost doubled. Now, these new foundations show strong influence from Mycenae. By late Helladic 3B1, circa 1300, the Saronic region, including Aegina, was fully incorporated politically and culturally into the Mycenaean state. Mycenae had broken apart the old Saronic world and incorporated the region into its own sphere of land and sea connections. Now let's insert Kalamianos into this narrative. Kalamianos was discovered in 2001 and is the focus of SHARP, which Jan mentioned, and I co-direct with Daniel Pullen of Florida State. Kalamianos again in red. The site itself is preserved as a large architectural complex of the 13th century BC, the Palatial period, with more than 50 buildings, many of them monumental, exposed on the surface as foundations and walls spread over 8 hectares. But the Korphos region has a longer history as a Saronic coastscape. In early Helladic II, Kalamianos was a substantial node tied into a nascent Saronic small world centered at Colonna. 2 major settlements, one at Kalamianos and an even larger one at Styri, high on a coastal cliff above, were founded. Obsidian from the island of Milos, 170 kilometers away, was imported as raw nodules and processed at Kalamianos, as was andesite from Aegina, found both as raw nodules and finished groundstone implements. In the hinterland, our surface survey discovered early Bronze Age stone cairns and enclosures. And if we look here at the distribution map of cairns and enclosures, we see that this was a highly humanized and exploited landscape. But beginning in EH3 and lasting for more than 500 years, Kalamianos becomes almost invisible archaeologically, like so many other small settlements in southern Greece. Only a few sherds with Aiginetan pot marks give evidence of sparse human presence. This corresponds to the period in which Colonna's attention lay outside the Saronic and beyond. In the transitional period when Colonna and Mycenae vied for hegemony in the Saronic, Kalamianos was part of a contested periphery, set almost exactly halfway between the two. Here we see the first signs in architecture and pottery in late Helladic 3a that Kalamianos was reestablished and interacting with the outside world. Then around 1300, the urban port was founded and built, most likely by Mycenae. The port may have served two objectives. First, as a foothold for maritime economic and military activity in the Saronic, and second, as a definitive statement of Mycenae's ascendancy in clear view from Colonna. This meaning is encoded in the monumentality of the architecture, marking Kalamianos as a second-order center and probably Mycenae's principal Saronic harbor. This is a plan of the architectural complexes and remains of two phases of enclosure wall. Coastal subsidence has submerged part of the site to the south. And here's a view of some of the Mycenaean building remains. There are quite large stones being used in these buildings. And courtesy of Giuliano Bianco, here is an image of what some of these buildings may have looked like. So in the 13th century, the Mycenaeans developed the economic potential of both the lowland and upland zones by building Kalamianos and a second settlement at Styria with expansive views overlooking the Saronic Gulf and fertile basins and hills that could be used for growing grain and tree crops and for grazing livestock, just as they are today. From there, a natural path, shown by the dashed line, through the mountains leads to the west to the interior of the Corinthia and the Argolid and to Mycenae itself. Also on the slopes, the Mycenaeans erected an extensive system of agricultural terraces, shown here in red, to maximize productive capacity. And here we see the visual seascape from Kalamianos. The daily frame of visual reference was the islands and coastlines of the Saronic, each with their own coastscapes. Colonna on Aegian looming right in the center of the Gulf of this small world. And the epilogue is that Kalamianos was abandoned around 1200 BC. We haven't found even a sherd of late Helladic 3C. And so we think that the fate of our harbor site is closely tied with that of the Mycenaean palatial system, with its demise, just as it was to the vibrant maritime life of that system. So the brief example here shows that the Saronic was susceptible to the emergence of a maritime small world because visual contact, ease of movement by sea, and moderate distances facilitated connectivity and the experiential sense of a coherent world. Interweaving the stories of Colonna and Kalamianos over time allows us to move beyond static maps to access the dynamism of a small world oscillating between cohesion and fragmentation over time, responding to internal forces as well as shifting centers of power played out beyond the Saronic. In the last part of my presentation, I'd like to talk about recovering maritime communities. Aegean Bronze Age maritime communities are nearly invisible. How did seafarers organize themselves as a distinctive group within the larger society? How was their knowledge transmitted and preserved across generations as a maritime habitus? What kinds of maritime networks did they form and at what scales? There are two sources of information that I think can help. The first is the rich ethnographic record of pre-modern and traditional seafaring communities around the world, for example, in the Southern Pacific or in South Asia. We learned the ways that seafarers protected and perpetuated their esoteric knowledge by encoding it in a vivid body of maritime lore learned only through apprenticeship and experience. We learned the social and economic networks they form, and we can ask which orientations and mentalities tend to be universal and which specific to place and time. So at Sharp, we recorded oral histories from older residents of the fishing village and in the inland village of Sophie Cove. It's no exaggeration to say that prior to World War II, people in these communities lived more like their ancient counterparts than those of the 21st century. Their stories revealed interesting information about the maritime world of the early 20th century Saronic Gulf. Korphos joined in a bustling small world network with other ports such as Piraeus, Salamis, Aegina, and Neopitavros, but in this case there was no dominant power, but instead a non-hierarchical arrangement of interacting nodes. The people of Korphos clearly looked to the sea. They intermarried in the islands, they wore island clothes, sang island songs, danced island dances. They contrasted themselves with the inland mountain people of Sophie Cove. Young boys learned their craft, their habitus, from their fathers and grandfathers through practical instruction and a wealth of stories. And to continue in this vein, on Sunday I'll be boarding a plane to India to begin a new ethno-archaeological project among the traditional fishing communities of Kerala State. By recording their oral histories, I'm searching for more indications of universal aspects of the habitus of small-scale maritime societies. And finally, then, we can connect this information with a second source, the earliest Greek literature, Homer's Odyssey and Hesiod's works and days. Hesiod imparts some information that is helpful in envisioning everyday maritime activity in a small world. He describes farmers who own a small boat and travel the nearby coastline and islands selling their produce. Hesiod himself rode a ferry across to Evia to attend funerary competitions. These characters represent the local sea travelers of the maritime small world. In Homer's Odyssey, we meet the captains, helmsmen, sailors, and rowers possessing knowledge of seafaring and navigation and experience of the broad sea. The context of Odysseus' wandering among malevolent gods and monsters and the incomprehensible custom of strange island inhabitants may most clearly correspond to the incipient colonization of the central Mediterranean in the 8th century, but we can also detect traces of maritime lore, perhaps as old as the Bronze Age, containing elements of phenomenological itineraries full of periplus-like sailing directions, mnemonic devices for recalling details of long voyages, and cautionary tales told in metaphorical and possibly encoded terms, including segmented journeys from headland to headland, storms and gales, coastal hazards including narrow passages and submerged rocks and coastal shelves, rough seas with currents, waves, whirlpools, and eddies, and potentially hostile natives. Naming and animating these people, places, and forces of nature began the process of domestication of an unfamiliar part of the world. Very brief conclusion. To conclude, I'm suggesting that we refocus some of our efforts to the local scale of coastscapes and small worlds and build up to larger networks from there. I think we can effectively do this by integrating information from geomorphology, archaeology, ethnography, and text. Thank you.